Welcome Internet. Today we're going to talk about how to handle the superego during psychotherapy. So before we dive in, I'm going to be clear on the terms. When I'm talking about superego in this video, I'm only going to be talking about the oedipal superego, not the early superego a la Melanie Klein, which I'm going to leave on the side for this video. I'm really talking about the oedipal superego, the superego that is basically the remnants of parental authority and by extension the rules of society. So it's that part of the mind in which the individual feels that he has to abide by. It's the moral rules, it's the how to behave kind of instance and moral instance of the mind. And in a myriad of cases, this instance that basically plays the role of the police force of the mind can go a little bit too extreme, and it can cause a lot of problems and a lot of issues. So one of the main problems is that sometimes the superego is going to grow too severe towards the ego of the patient, meaning that the patient will not feel at ease to make their choices and will feel intense guilt or even intense fear at the idea of an internal reprimand, meaning that they're going to inhibit themselves and their ability to have actions and power in the world. So one of the main reasons why I wanted to make this video is that the superego can be basically an obstacle in the life of the patient. Thus, there might be reason to try and de-escalate it or defocus from it. So the underlying concept that I have for this video is this idea that in the case of a severe superego or a superego that is too strong, is that the ego and the superego are not united enough, that the bridge hasn't been gapped between the two. That the two have basically not become unified, but have pitched themselves one against the other. The superego not trusting the ego's ability to correct or to use drives and energy in a correct manner, and the ego fearing the repression and the strength of the superego. So the question is, how can we help as therapists the patient to try and undermine that superego influence? Well, I think one of the first ways of dealing with it is to try and understand what is the core of the superego made out of. So how we do this is trying to investigate the past of the patient. For example, when they think about that moral instance, who comes up? Is it a parent? Is it a sibling? Is it a teacher? Is it a relative? Who is talking and in what voice? Is it male, female, and so on and so forth? The idea behind this is to try and give an origin point to the superego, or at least as much as can be, because there's a lot of unconscious elements in it. Of course, I'm not arguing the opposite, but giving a framework of origin can help the patient at least identify where it's coming from. Once there's been that identification, what can be interesting is also to try and give a shape to the superego. So I very rarely say, what is your superego like, right? Because most patients might not know what it is, and even for those who might know, it's not that clear on jargon if it's helpful or not. So what I often say is that it seems that you're very severe with yourself, and that severity seems to stem from a part of yourself. And I often ask them, if you were to give a metaphor of it, what would it be? So what often comes in is the question, the idea of a judge or of a policeman, or in some instances even like a superhero that comes in and swipes the ego down, completely cuts it down. And often the aim of this is to give a shape to the superego. And then when the shape is given and the patient can visualize the superego, to try and get the patient to criticize the superego, to show that the ego itself can mobilize elements of itself to basically have corresponding energy and a corresponding strength to the superego, to try and invert this dynamic of superego repressing the ego basically strengthens up and fights the superego. So you might think, wait a minute, didn't you say that it should be unified? Well, I do think that, but for unification to happen, both have to be on the same level. Like, if the superego is too strong, there's no point in it uniting with the ego. Likewise, if the ego is too strong, there's no point in limiting itself through the superego. So both instances need to be at equal strength. At least this is how I conceptualize of relationship between instances. So in regards to this, once the ego can criticize it, and once a patient can criticize that part of themselves, that part of themselves loses this untouchability. Because that's another strength of the superego, is that it makes itself, when it's not united with the ego, as an untouchable instance, something that it cannot criticize, in the sense that the ego cannot criticize it, and it only gives criticism towards the ego. Therefore, what is happening is that it's only one way. Once we create a two-way dynamic, it becomes much more manageable for the patient to be able to criticize the superego. A criticism that is also backed, and let's not forget, by the transference, i.e. it's the therapist that is helping the patient being able to create this dynamic. Because it's the relationship with the therapist, the real presence of the therapist, that in a way lets the superego get criticized. Because what we have to remember is that by themselves, the patients might be stuck in this internal dynamic, in this internal loop. The presence of the therapist is, of course, going to reactivate imagos of the parents, but it's also going to mean that the superego is not as severe because there's someone else on which those remnants of parental authority is displaced. And the therapist is in part, not completely, but is in part an extension or a representation in the current present events of a parental figure, be it good or bad, right? So the superego is less obliged to be as strong when the therapist is present. And this internalization of the therapist is going to strengthen the ego of the patient, meaning that the ego is going to be more capable of fighting for itself against the superego. And by pointing out the superego, what basically the therapist is doing is showing that there is this part of the mind, that this part of the mind is not an a priori, it's not something that just is a given, it's something that exists and has an influence. Because what happens is that in the daily life of most patients don't think about the superego, not as something separate. They see it as just a given. It's something that's there and it is basically guilt-tripping them. By calling it out, by basically giving it a form, presence, and let's say a representation, what we're doing is that we're creating an image of the superego, a presence in the mind of the superego, a frame through which the superego can be understood by the patient, and the patient can basically fight against it. In the same way that during teenagehood, the teenager fights against the parents, which is healthy, even though the parents dislike it, it is very healthy for the teenager to be able to rebel in some way, shape, or form. In the same way, it is very healthy for the ego to fight against the superego for a time. Now, the aim, as I was saying earlier in the video, is to create a form of unification. Because once a struggle is basically more equal, they can both work together in the interests of the patient. Meaning that, for example, I was talking earlier about how sometimes the superego basically cuts off the agency and potentials of the patient. When they're both on the same line, they can choice and decision making is simpler and much more doable. It also helps the patient to be able to renounce certain elements, to be able to give themselves more wiggle room with morals, to be able to understand that, yes, being morally right or morally in the right framework is important. It's also important for it to not become sacrifice, for it to not just be, I need to sacrifice my ego for the greater good. That my ego has also the potential to basically expand and gain things in the outside world. It's not a trade-off, it's a trade, meaning that you don't give something without a return. It goes both ways. And in this case, once the superego is criticized, once basically the ego has gained back strength and can basically be comrades with the superego, what happens is the patient becomes much more capable of making their choices without guilt, without this fundamental fear that something inside of them is going to turn against them. They become less afraid of themselves and more capable of basically owning to the decisions, be them right or wrong, right? We're not even talking about if things are gonna basically happen well, or if it's gonna have good consequences. We're really just talking about just the decision making. And often what happens is that regains strength, also gives the patient the agency to fight against what used to be representatives of the superego. For example, on the top of my head, a manager which was far from perfect or that was kind of repressive. And because the superego was basically working itself through them, the patient could not revolt. The patient was, in a way, fixed and basically unable to fight back. With the superego in line with the ego, and because the superego is now integrated better with the ego, both of them can fight against this authority figure without the fear of punishment, not from the outside world, but from the inner world. Which you might say, yes, okay, but there's still the outside world. Of course. But once you're not afraid of being internally punished, it opens up a whole level of freedom, because you're no longer obeying to internalized parental figures. You are quite the opposite, free from them. Therefore, is much more of an equalized force between both parties in the external world. So in a way, there's less inner division and more inner unity against the outside world. And this is very important, because often what happens is that other people in the life and lives of the patient become extensions of parts of oneself that they haven't seen. Meaning that, in a way, the other people in the outside world play a double role. The role that they have themselves in the outside world and of the object, i.e. the relationship, but also inner parts of them. And once the inner parts are understood, they have less of an influence in the outside world, meaning the choices are much easier made. There's also this very important point that once the energy of the superego is realigned, there's potential for more, that the patient can do more. Not necessarily be productive, right, per se, but just that they have more time for themselves, they feel better with themselves, they feel more at ease with themselves, meaning that all of the pressure that would have been there through the superego is basically cut, and meaning that they can enjoy things more and use their time in a better, subjectively, manner for themselves, right? And this is why it's so important to be able to manage the superego, because the superego is not something to be destroyed or to be wrecked. It's something to be, in a way, reframed and reintegrated within the framework. In a way, it's not about dividing even more. It's about reuniting, creating a new framework inside of the mind. A framework in which two of these instances can coexist and even cooperate, rather than be one against the other. And of course, and this is very important, and I want you to understand this, I'm not saying that this is a protocol that will grant success. Absolutely not. This is just ideas that I find worthy of sharing with you because I think they're interesting. But this is only my perspective, and I need to make this very clear. Also, and this is very important, the superego deconstruction might take much more time with people with more severe psychopathologies because the ego is more ruthless and the superego is even more ruthless than that. So it might take more time, more habilitation, etc., etc. And lastly, even though I'm talking about technique, it's only one perspective. I don't want to imply that there's no other, quite the opposite. It's one among many. But I think it's still interesting, and that's why I wanted to share it with you today. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you have any questions or anything you would like to ask, feel free to do so in the comments. I'll see you next one.